The corridors of Xenari Academy gleamed with the soft phosphorescence that Zephyrians preferred to harsh artificial lighting, creating an ethereal glow that made Marcus Chen feel like he was walking through a dream. Or a nightmare, depending on how the next few hours went. First human student in the Academy's 300-year history, he muttered to himself, adjusting the strap of his bag as he approached the classroom where he'd either prove that humanity deserved a place among the galaxy's intellectual elite or confirm every stereotype about human limitations. The door to advanced theoretical physics dilated silently as he approached, revealing a classroom that looked more like an art installation than a learning environment. Curved surfaces flowed seamlessly into each other, holographic displays floated at optimal viewing angles, and the seating arrangement seemed designed to facilitate both individual focus and group collaboration. What struck Marcus most, however, was the sudden, absolute silence that fell as he stepped into the room. 23 pairs of silver eyes turned toward him with the coordinated precision of a military formation. 23 young women with various shades of blue skin, from pale aqua to deep sapphire, their long ears elegantly pointed and currently angled forward with attention. 23 expressions that ranged from mild curiosity to barely concealed disdain. "Ah, Mr. Chen," Professor Velandra said, her melodic voice carrying the formal tones that marked educated Zephyrian speech. "Welcome to Advanced Theoretical Physics. Class, this is Marcus Chen, participating in our cultural exchange program." The murmurs that followed were conducted in rapid Zephyrian, but Marcus's crash course in the language was sufficient to catch phrases like, primitive human, and academic charity case. His face burned, but he kept his expression neutral. A skill he'd learned during diplomatic training. "Mr. Chen, please take the available seat," Professor Velandra continued, gesturing toward the back corner of the classroom. Marcus walked the gauntlet of stairs, feeling like a specimen under examination. The empty seat was, predictably, isolated from the cluster where most students had arranged themselves. As he settled into the flowing chair that automatically adjusted to his physiology, he caught fragments of whispered conversations. "Probably can't even comprehend quantum dimensional matrices. Father says the exchange program is political pandering. Wonder if he can actually keep up with the coursework." But as the whispers died down and Professor Velandra began her lecture on multidimensional energy harmonics, Marcus noticed something that made him forget his embarrassment. One student hadn't looked away. She sat 3 rows ahead and slightly to his left, her skin a deeper blue than most of the others, almost navy in the classroom's soft lighting. Her silver eyes hadn't left him since he'd entered, but unlike the others whose stares felt judgmental or dismissive, hers seemed analytical. Curious. As if she was solving a puzzle rather than passing judgment. Her name tag, visible when she turned slightly to retrieve something from her bag, read Lyra Synthara. The surname suggested minor nobility. Most Zephyrian aristocratic families carried the Sin prefix, but her posture lacked the casual arrogance that marked most of her highborn classmates. Professor Velandra's lecture was every bit as challenging as Marcus had expected. Theoretical physics from a Zephyrian perspective emphasized intuitive understanding of energy fields and dimensional interactions that human science approached through mathematical abstractions. Where humans built equations to describe reality, Zephyrians seemed to perceive it directly. The quantum foam exhibits resonance patterns that any sensitive individual should be able to detect, Professor Velandra explained, manipulating a holographic display that showed particle interactions in dimensions Marcus could barely visualize. "Miss Kethera, would you demonstrate the standard technique for measuring dimensional flux?" A pale blue student near the front stood gracefully, extending her hand toward the holographic display. Marcus watched in fascination as the display responded to her presence, showing energy patterns that shifted and flowed around her fingers. "Excellent sensitivity," Professor Velandra approved. "The flux readings are well within optimal parameters." Marcus tried not to feel inadequate as he realized that most of his classmates possessed telepathic and empathic abilities that were rare among humans. They weren't just studying theoretical physics. They were experiencing it in ways his species couldn't match. But as the lesson progressed, he noticed that Lyra, the girl who kept watching him, never volunteered to demonstrate. When called upon, she performed competently but without the evident enjoyment that marked her more gifted classmates. Her responses were technically correct but lacked the intuitive leaps that Professor Velandra praised in others. For tomorrow, Professor Velandra announced as the lesson drew to a close, please review the principles of quantum entanglement as they apply to consciousness transfer. We'll be exploring practical applications in our next session. As students began gathering their materials, the conversations resumed, most still centered around the novelty of having a human in their midst. Bet he doesn't even have basic telepathic sensitivity. Wonder what his test scores were to get admitted. Probably needs special accommodations just to follow the lectures. Marcus packed his bag slowly, giving the others time to leave before facing the corridor full of students who would undoubtedly continue their assessment of his presence. But as he stood to go, he found Lyra standing beside his desk, her silver eyes meeting his with a directness that was startling. You understood the lecture, she said, her voice softer than Professor Velandra's formal tones but carrying a clarity that suggested careful thought behind each word. Some of it, Marcus admitted. The mathematical frameworks are familiar, even if the intuitive elements are challenging for humans. You were taking notes on dimensional interaction theory, Lyra observed. Most students don't bother, they assume they'll remember the concepts naturally. Human memory isn't as reliable as Zephyrian recall, Marcus said. We have to work harder to retain complex information. Lyra tilted her head slightly, her long years adjusting to focus on him more precisely. Working harder isn't a weakness. The simple statement, delivered without condescension or pity, was the first genuinely accepting thing anyone had said to him since his arrival. Marcus started, then stopped, not sure how to respond to unexpected kindness. Would you mind if I sat next to you tomorrow? Lyra asked, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been nervousness. Marcus blinked, certain he'd misheard. You want to sit next to me? If that's acceptable, she said, then added with what might have been the ghost of a smile, I think it might be interesting to see the lectures from a different perspective. Yes, Marcus said, probably too quickly. I mean, of course. That would be nice. Lyra's smile became more definite. Good. I'll see you tomorrow, Marcus Chen. As she left the classroom with fluid grace, Marcus stood frozen by his desk, replaying the conversation and wondering if he'd imagined the whole thing. The classroom felt different somehow, less like a hostile environment and more like a place where unexpected things might happen. For the first time since arriving at Xenari Academy, Marcus found himself looking forward to tomorrow. Marcus arrived at the physics classroom 15 minutes early the next morning, partly from nervousness and partly from genuine curiosity about whether Lyra had meant what she said. The classroom was empty except for the soft hum of environmental systems and the gentle phosphorescent glow that never quite felt like adequate lighting to his human eyes. He took his usual seat in the back corner and tried to review his notes from the previous day, but found himself glancing at the door every few seconds. When other students began filtering in, their conversations once again conducted in rapid Zephyrian that his limited vocabulary couldn't follow, he felt the familiar weight of isolation settling on his shoulders. Good morning, Marcus. He looked up to find Lyra standing beside the empty seat next to his, a satchel that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light slung over her shoulder. Her greeting was delivered in careful, formal human English rather than the more natural Zephyrian he'd expected. You came, he said, then immediately felt foolish for stating the obvious. I said I would, Lyra replied, settling into the chair with the fluid grace that seemed universal among her species. Though I should warn you, sitting next to me might not improve your social standing here. Why not? Lyra arranged her materials with precise efficiency, but Marcus caught a hint of something that might have been self-consciousness in her movements. I'm not particularly popular among my classmates. I ask too many questions, challenge too many assumptions, and I have opinions about art that most Zephyrians find eccentric. Eccentric how? I think individual expression is more important than collective harmony, she said, her voice dropping slightly. Which is practically heretical in traditional Zephyrian culture. Marcus studied her profile as she spoke, noting the way her ears drooped slightly when she mentioned her unpopular opinions. For what it's worth, I think individual expression is pretty important too. Yes, Lyra said, turning to meet his eyes directly. I thought you might. Professor Valandra's arrival interrupted their conversation, but Marcus found himself paying more attention to Lyra's reactions than to the lecture itself. She took notes with the same meticulous care he did, but her annotations were different, not just recording information, but questioning underlying assumptions and making connections that seemed to go beyond the standard curriculum. When Professor Valandra posed a particularly challenging problem about quantum field interactions, the usual suspects raised their hands, the top students who always seemed to know the answers before the questions were fully asked. But as the discussion progressed and the proposed solutions grew increasingly complex, Marcus noticed something interesting. They were all wrong. Not completely wrong, but they were approaching the problem from the same angle, making the same fundamental assumption about energy flow that led them into increasingly elaborate dead ends. Marcus could see the error clearly. His human training in linear mathematical processes made the flaw obvious, but he hesitated to speak up. Every previous attempt to contribute had been met with polite dismissal or barely concealed irritation. Anyone else? Professor Valandra asked, clearly hoping someone would find the solution she was looking for. Marcus felt Lyra's gaze on him and turned to meet her eyes. She nodded almost imperceptibly, and something in her expression gave him the courage he needed. Professor, he said, raising his hand. I think there might be a different approach. The classroom fell silent with the same abrupt completeness that had marked his first entrance. Professor Valandra's ears perked forward with interest, though whether from genuine curiosity or academic politeness was unclear. Please, Mr. Chen. Share your thoughts. Marcus stood, moving to the holographic display at the front of the classroom. His hands trembled slightly as he began manipulating the energy patterns, but his voice grew steadier as he explained his reasoning. Everyone's been assuming that the quantum fields maintain constant phase relationships, but what if that's not true? What if the phase variance isn't a measurement error but an actual property of the interaction? He adjusted the display parameters, showing how the seemingly chaotic fluctuations actually followed a predictable pattern when viewed from a different mathematical framework. The solution that emerged was elegant in its simplicity, requiring none of the elaborate compensations his classmates had proposed. By treating the variance as a feature rather than a bug, Marcus concluded, the whole system becomes self-regulating. The silence that followed was different from before, thoughtful rather than dismissive. Professor Valandra studied the display with obvious interest, her long ears twitching with what Marcus had learned to recognize as deep concentration. Fascinating, she said finally. A completely linear approach that somehow captures the essential nonlinear properties of the system. Most illuminating, Mr. Chen. As Marcus returned to his seat, he caught fragments of whispered conversations that were markedly different from the previous day's dismissive comments. Never would have thought to approach it that way. Actually quite clever for such a simple method. Maybe human thinking has some advantages. But the reaction that mattered most to him was Lyra's quiet, well done, as he settled back into his chair. How did you see that? She asked as Professor Valandra moved on to the next topic. The phase variance pattern wasn't obvious. It was to me, Marcus said. Human mathematics is all about finding patterns in apparent chaos. We're not good at intuitive leaps, but we're excellent at systematic analysis. Systematic analysis, Lyra repeated thoughtfully. We don't really learn that approach. Our education emphasizes natural sensitivity over methodical investigation. Different tools for different problems, Marcus suggested. Maybe that's why the exchange program exists, to show that different approaches can be complementary rather than competitive. Lyra was quiet for a moment, making notes that seemed to have little to do with Professor Valandra's current lecture. Marcus, she said finally, would you be interested in studying together? I mean, outside of class. I think I could learn a lot from your systematic approach. And I could definitely use help with the intuitive elements, Marcus replied. Zephyrian physics makes leaps that human logic can't always follow. It's settled then, Lyra said with a smile that transformed her entire face. Though I should warn you, I have some rather unconventional study habits. Unconventional how? I like to work with background music. And I tend to think better when I'm creating something with my hands. And I ask a lot of questions that most people find annoying. Marcus found himself smiling back. I think I can handle annoying questions. And I'm curious about the music and the creating things. Good, Lyra said, her voice carrying a warmth that made something tight in Marcus's chest begin to relax. I think this is going to be an interesting partnership. As the class ended and students began filing out, Marcus noticed that several of his classmates glanced his way with expressions that were curious rather than dismissive. Some even nodded politely as they passed, a level of acknowledgement he hadn't received before. But what struck him most was the way Lyra gathered her materials without any apparent hurry, as if she was in no rush to escape his company. For the first time since arriving at Xenari Academy, Marcus felt like he might actually belong somewhere. Lyra, he said as they prepared to leave. Yes. Thank you. For sitting next to me. For encouraging me to speak up. For. He gestured vaguely, searching for words to express what her simple acts of kindness meant to him. For treating you like a person instead of a curiosity, she suggested gently. Exactly. Marcus, Lyra said, her silver eyes meeting his with that same direct intensity that had first caught his attention, you don't need to thank me for basic decency. Though I'm glad it helps. As they walked out of the classroom together, Marcus realized that for the first time in days, he wasn't dreading tomorrow's lesson. In fact, he was rather looking forward to it. Their first official study session took place in Lyra's dormitory room 3 days later, and Marcus discovered that unconventional study habits was a considerable understatement. The room itself was unlike anything he'd expected from a Zephyrian living space. Instead of the minimalist aesthetic that seemed to dominate the academy, Lyra's quarters were filled with what could only be described as controlled chaos. Three-dimensional light sculptures hung suspended in the air, casting shifting patterns of color across the walls. Musical instruments from at least 4 different species were arranged in what seemed like random clusters but probably followed some artistic logic Marcus couldn't perceive. Books and data tablets were stacked on every available surface, many of them marked with handwritten notes in what appeared to be multiple languages. Welcome to my organized disaster, Lyra said, gesturing for him to sit on a cushioned floor mat that was softer than it looked. I know it's not very Zephyrian, but I think better in environments that stimulate multiple senses. It's incredible, Marcus said, genuinely meaning it. The room felt alive in a way that his sterile dormitory quarters never could. Did you create all of these sculptures? Most of them. They're study aids, actually. Each one represents a different theoretical concept. Lyra touched a control panel, and one of the sculptures began to slowly rotate, its internal light patterns shifting to demonstrate quantum field interactions. I find that when I can see abstract concepts as physical forms, I understand them better. Marcus watched the light sculpture with fascination, seeing familiar equations represented as flowing geometries that made their relationships suddenly clear. This is brilliant. You're visualizing mathematical relationships as artistic forms. You can see the mathematics in them? Lyra's ears perked forward with interest. Most people just see pretty lights. The mathematics is what makes them beautiful, Marcus said, studying the way energy flows were represented as color gradients. Form following function, but elevated to art. Lyra's smile was radiant. Yes. Exactly. That's what I've been trying to explain to my classmates, but they think I'm wasting time with frivolous decoration when I should be focusing on pure theory. Pure theory without practical application is just mental exercise, Marcus observed. But theory that can be experienced, visualized, made tangible, that's knowledge you can actually use. They settled into their study routine with surprising ease. Lyra helped Marcus understand the intuitive leaps that came naturally to Zephyrian thinking, while he showed her how human systematic analysis could provide structure for her creative insights. The background music she'd mentioned turned out to be compositions of her own creation, haunting melodies that seemed to follow the mathematical patterns they were studying. "You wrote this?" Marcus asked during a break, listening to a piece that somehow captured the essence of multidimensional geometry in musical form. "It's based on the harmonic relationships in quantum field theory," Lyra explained, her fingers dancing across what appeared to be a crystalline keyboard. "Each note represents a different energy state, and the way they interact musically mirrors the way they interact physically." "Play it again," Marcus requested. "But this time, let me see the mathematical notation while you play." What followed was a revelation for both of them. As Lyra played and Marcus followed the underlying equations, they began to see connections neither had noticed before. The music made the mathematics emotionally resonant, while the mathematics gave the music structural depth that elevated it beyond simple beauty. "We should document this," Marcus said as the piece ended. "The relationship between mathematical harmony and musical harmony. It could be the basis for an entirely new approach to theoretical education." "You think so?" Lyra's voice carried a note of hope that suggested this was something she dreamed of but never thought possible. "I know so. This is revolutionary, Lyra. You found a way to make abstract theory experientially accessible." Their collaboration expanded naturally beyond academics. Marcus shared human cultural elements that fascinated Lyra, poetry that emphasized individual emotion over collective harmony, visual art that celebrated imperfection rather than pursuing ethereal beauty, stories that focused on personal growth rather than societal obligation. "Human creativity is so personal," Lyra observed after Marcus played her a recording of jazz music. "Each performer is expressing their own interpretation rather than contributing to a unified whole." "Is that bad?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "It's different. Zephyrian art is about creating harmony, achieving balance, contributing to something larger than oneself." She paused, considering. "But there's something beautiful about individual expression too. It's brave." "Brave?" "To say, this is how I see the world, instead of, this is how we all see the world. To risk being wrong or different or misunderstood." Lyra's voice grew softer. "I've always wanted to be that brave." "You are brave," Marcus said firmly. "You sat next to the alien outcast when no one else would. You share your art even though others don't understand it. You ask questions that challenge accepted wisdom. That takes courage." The conversation was interrupted by a chime from Lyra's door communicator. She opened the connection to reveal one of their classmates, Kathera, the pale blue student who had demonstrated quantum sensitivity during their first class together. "Lyra," Kathera said, her tone carrying the formal politeness that masked obvious disapproval. "Some of us are studying for tomorrow's exam in the common area. We thought you might want to join us." "Thank you, but I'm already studying," Lyra replied, gesturing toward Marcus. Kathera's silver eyes flicked to Marcus with barely concealed disdain. "With the human? Lyra, surely you could find more appropriate study partners." "Marcus is an excellent study partner," Lyra said, her voice taking on an edge that Marcus had never heard before. "His insights have been invaluable." "I'm sure," Kathera replied with the kind of polite skepticism that was somehow worse than open hostility. "Well, if you change your mind about more traditional study methods, you know where to find us." After the connection closed, Lyra sat in silence for a moment, her ears drooping with what Marcus was learning to recognize as emotional distress. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I know my friendship with you makes things complicated for both of us." "Complicated how?" "You're already facing enough challenges here without being associated with the Academy's resident eccentric. And I." She paused, seeming to struggle with her words. "I've never had many friends among my own people. Being seen with a human probably makes me even more of an outsider." Marcus looked around the room, at the light sculptures that made complex theories beautiful, at the musical instruments that turned mathematics into art, at the organized chaos that somehow made perfect sense. Lyra, if being an outsider means thinking independently and creating beauty and asking important questions, then I'm proud to be an outsider with you. Her smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. Really? Really? Besides, Marcus added with a grin, I've learned more in 3 study sessions with you than I did in 3 weeks of traditional classes. If that makes us both outcasts, then being an outcast is clearly the superior academic strategy. Lyra laughed. A sound like musical bells that made Marcus realize he'd do almost anything to hear it again. In that case, she said, shall we continue our outcast education? I have some ideas about harmonizing quantum theory with artistic expression that I think you'll find interesting. As they returned to their studies, surrounded by light and music and the comfortable chaos of creative minds at work, Marcus realized that he'd found something at Xenari Academy that he hadn't expected to find anywhere, a place where he belonged, and someone who understood that belonging didn't mean conforming. It meant finding someone whose differences complemented your own, creating something together that was more beautiful than either could achieve alone. The annual Innovation Fair at Xenari Academy was traditionally a showcase for the galaxy's most promising young minds, where students presented original research that demonstrated their mastery of advanced theoretical concepts. For Marcus and Lyra, it became the perfect opportunity to prove that their unconventional partnership could produce results that neither human nor Zephyrian education had achieved independently. Are you sure about this? Marcus asked as they put the finishing touches on their presentation 3 days before the fair. We're essentially challenging centuries of established educational philosophy. That's exactly why we have to do it, Lyra replied, adjusting one of her light sculptures to better demonstrate their hybrid theoretical framework. Marcus, we've discovered something revolutionary, a way to make abstract concepts accessible through experiential learning. If we don't share it, we're wasting an opportunity to help others understand the universe the way we've learned to understand it. Their project, officially titled Harmonic Integration of Mathematical and Artistic Expression in Theoretical Physics Education, represented months of collaboration that had evolved far beyond simple study sessions. They had documented how musical composition could illustrate quantum field relationships, how three-dimensional art could make multidimensional mathematics tangible, and how the emotional resonance of creative expression could enhance retention of complex theoretical concepts. The preliminary reviews from the selection committee were interesting, Marcus said, consulting the feedback they'd received. Professor Velandra called our approach unprecedented but potentially transformative. Dean Morthek described it as either brilliant or completely misguided. And the human liaison said it was exactly the kind of cross-cultural innovation the exchange program was designed to foster. In other words, nobody knows what to make of us, Lyra summarized with a smile that had become increasingly frequent over their months of partnership. Pretty much. But they're curious enough to give us a slot in the primary presentation schedule. The day of the Innovation Fair dawned bright and clear, with the space station's artificial solar cycle providing optimal lighting for the presentation halls. Marcus and Lyra arrived early to set up their display, which looked more like an art installation than a traditional academic presentation. Light sculptures representing different theoretical concepts hung at strategic points around their assigned space, while musical instruments were positioned to demonstrate the harmonic relationships they discovered. Interactive displays allowed visitors to manipulate mathematical variables and see how the changes affected both the visual art and the accompanying music. It's beautiful, said Dr. Sarah Kim, the human exchange coordinator, as she stopped by their booth during the setup period. But does it actually work? Can students really learn theoretical physics through artistic expression? See for yourself, Lyra said, activating their main demonstration. Dr. Kim, what's your background in quantum field theory? Basic undergraduate level, nothing advanced. Perfect. Lyra guided her to the central control interface. Try manipulating these field strength parameters while listening to the musical changes and watching the light patterns. What followed was 15 minutes of the most effective physics education Marcus had ever witnessed. Dar. Kim, who had struggled with quantum concepts in her formal education, began to intuitively understand field interactions through their artistic representation. When a particularly complex relationship became clear to her, her expression of wonder made all their months of work worthwhile. "This is incredible," she said finally. "I actually understand what's happening. The music makes the mathematical relationships feel natural instead of abstract." Word of their demonstration spread quickly through the fair. Within hours, their booth was surrounded by students, faculty, and researchers from institutions across the galaxy. The response was unlike anything either Marcus or Lyra had anticipated. "Remarkable integration of sensory modalities," observed Dr. Xenari from the Rigel Institute of Advanced Studies. "You've essentially created a universal language for theoretical concepts that transcend species-specific learning preferences." Professor Velandra arrived with a delegation of senior faculty, her expression shifting from professional curiosity to genuine amazement as she experienced their demonstration. "Miss Cynthia, Mr. Chen, you've accomplished something that our education committees have been trying to achieve for decades, truly inclusive learning that leverages the strengths of different cognitive approaches." But the moment that mattered most to Marcus came when Kethera and several of their classmates stopped by the booth. The same students who had dismissed him as academically inferior were now struggling to understand concepts that became immediately clear through the artistic presentation. "I don't understand," Kethera said, manipulating the controls and watching her modifications play out in music and light. "How is this possible? These relationships are usually so difficult to grasp." "Different approaches work for different minds," Lyra explained gently. "What seems natural to you through telepathic sensitivity might be clearer to others through artistic expression." "You mean, there's nothing wrong with needing different teaching methods?" asked another student, a shy girl who had always struggled with the Academy's traditional approach. "There's something wrong with educational systems that only serve one type of mind," Marcus replied. "Every student deserves to learn in ways that make sense to them." The conversation that followed represented a fundamental shift in how their classmates viewed both the human exchange student and their own learning experiences. Students who had felt inadequate because they didn't match the traditional Zephyrian model of intuitive brilliance discovered that their different approaches to understanding had value. "You've started something here," Professor Velandra told them as the formal presentations concluded. "The Innovation Committee wants to discuss implementing your methods across the curriculum. Several other academies have already expressed interest in pilot programs." As the crowds dispersed and they began packing their equipment, Marcus found himself alone with Lyra for the first time all day. The adrenaline of success was beginning to fade, replaced by a deeper awareness of what they had accomplished together. "We did it," Lyra said softly, looking around at the booth that had become the center of academic attention. "We actually proved that different ways of thinking can create something better than either approach alone." "We proved more than that," Marcus replied, watching her face in the soft glow of her light sculptures. "We proved that when two people really understand each other, they can change the world." Something in his tone made Lyra look at him more closely, her silver eyes searching his expression. "Marcus, I need to tell you something." "What?" "That first day, when I couldn't stop staring at you in class, it wasn't just intellectual curiosity." Her voice grew softer, more vulnerable than he'd ever heard it. "I was fascinated by your resilience. By the way you kept trying to contribute even when others dismissed you. By your willingness to see value in differences instead of threats." Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. "Lyra. I know it's complicated. We're from different species, different worlds. And I know that relationships between humans and Zephyrians are rare because the cultural differences can be so vast." She paused, gathering courage. "But Marcus, what we've built together, this partnership, this understanding, this ability to make each other better, it feels like something worth protecting. It feels like something worth building a life around," Marcus said, stepping closer to her. "Lyra, I've been trying to figure out how to tell you that somewhere between that first study session and today, I stopped thinking of you as just a friend and started thinking of you as everything." Her smile was radiant, transforming her entire face with joy that seemed to light up the space around them. Really? Really? Though I should warn you, dating a human probably comes with its own set of complications. I'm quite fond of complications, Lyra said, reaching for his hand. Especially the kind that challenge assumptions and create beautiful solutions to impossible problems. In that case, Marcus said, intertwining their fingers and marveling at how perfectly they fit together despite their different anatomy, I think we're going to have a very interesting future. 6 months later, as they prepared to graduate from Xenari Academy and begin their joint doctoral program at the University of New Geneva, their relationship had become part of the Academy's legend. The quiet girl who had broken the silence to sit next to the human outsider had become the co-creator of educational methods that were revolutionizing learning across the galaxy. Their love story was whispered about in dormitories and discussed in faculty meetings as proof that the most meaningful connections often form between the most unlikely partners. But for Marcus and Lyra, the real magic wasn't in defying expectations, it was in finding someone who understood that true love meant helping each other become the best versions of themselves. Ready for the next adventure? Lyra asked as they stood together on the observation deck, watching the transport that would take them to their new university preparing to dock. With you? Marcus replied, watching the stars reflect in her silver eyes. I can't think of anything I'm more ready for. As the transport carried them toward their future, their hands intertwined and their dreams perfectly aligned, both of them knew that they had found something rarer than academic success or professional recognition. They had found a love that bridged not just the space between worlds, but the space between who they had been and who they were meant to become together.